Buongiorno. Thank you. I appreciate your patience today for my limitation that I must address you in English, so thank you. Thank you to our hosts, ICMQ, and especially Mr. Orsenigo. It is wonderful to be back in Italy. I'll be speaking today about the application of Envision in the United States and Canada, but I just want to take a moment to say how much I truly value the partnership between the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure and ICMQ. As we look at the challenges that we face as a planet, the challenges transcend national boundaries, and our solutions to those challenges must also transcend national boundaries. And just yesterday we were speaking of the many novel and innovative solutions that have been pioneered here in Italy that we are now taking back to the Institute to apply in our communities. So I thank you for that and for the partnership, as I said, with ICMQ. This was the initial partnership. You'll see in my presentation there are more, and I welcome in the future many more that will join us in this pursuit. A brief introduction to the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. I know Mr. Orsenigo gave you a little bit of an overview. We are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to advance the cause of sustainable infrastructure. And so in that regard, we were founded by three of the major American associations: the American Public Works Association, which represents much of the infrastructure owners; the American Council of Engineering Companies, which represents the engineering consultants; and the American Society of Civil Engineers, which represents the profession of engineering, and with over 160,000 members is one of the largest engineering associations in the world. And so consensus and collaboration is really in our DNA as an organization. As I mentioned, solving the challenges that we face will require all of us working together and bringing together the best that we have to offer. So ISI is really a hub for the industry. Our goal is to identify where in the pursuit of sustainable infrastructure there are opportunities for consensus, collaboration, and where shared resources, standardized approaches are the most effective, cost-efficient, and ultimately better for our communities. So as you can see, our membership includes numerous companies, government agencies, local governments, as well as academic institutions. And of course, as I mentioned, we now have partners all around the world, first and foremost being ICMQ and the work that we've done here, but also the Canadian Society for Civil Engineers and the Mexican Federation of Civil Engineering. And so I see this as an opportunity. Envision is really a framework of global principles that can be applied anywhere. And so we look for local partners, again, like ICMQ and the work done here in Italy, to do so. And I'll talk more about that. And then Mr. Orsenigo already mentioned Harvard University as our partners in developing Envision. So I believe we are at a real critical moment in history, certainly for any of our lives, and perhaps for the planet as a whole. We know there are numerous challenges: climate change, resilience, equity and social justice, biodiversity loss, public health, especially in light of COVID, and the economic recovery that is needed. Any one of these challenges would be daunting in and of itself. We have to solve them all simultaneously, and we know from the IPCC reports that we have a very small window of time to make these changes. And when you look at them, infrastructure will play a critical role in all of this. At the same time, we know that in most developed countries, for decades, we have seen an underinvestment in infrastructure, an aging and a degradation of our infrastructure, and in the developing world, the need for new infrastructure. And now, in light of COVID, we see investments around the world of many trillions of dollars that will be going to infrastructure. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will build much of the infrastructure that will set the trajectory of our planet for the next 50 to 100 years. So when you look at the scale of impact that our industry will have, really all eyes of the world are on us, and we have a huge moral responsibility to make sure that the work that we are doing establishes a bright and optimistic future for the human race. So not to put too much of a point on it, but it is very important issues that we are talking about today. Luckily, there is a roadmap for success. So we have seen the value that frameworks like Envision can play in the building industry through LEED and BREEAM. These are not theoretical outcomes. We have seen these happen over the last 20 to 30 years. So through consistent and standardized frameworks, we see accountability for government spending. We see understanding of the complex trade-offs that sustainability requires, again, addressing all of those challenges simultaneously. We see a prioritization of higher performing projects. So if we don't have a way of measuring sustainability within infrastructure, how can we choose what are the best projects? How can we set our goals? We need a way to understand our performance. Obviously, embedding those higher level goals into the project delivery and a standardized national and international approach. I think one of the great lessons that we have learned over the last 2 years with COVID has been that when we are dealing with a global challenge, we cannot do it on our own. We cannot do it piecemeal. It requires a standardized, homogeneous, collaborative effort. And it will be the same with sustainable infrastructure and sustainability for our planet. So we know that this is the path that we need to take, and also initiating this systemic change. So I'll talk more in the presentation later, but tools like Envision are not just about the design and the delivery of the project itself. It's about transforming the entire industry, the entire system around which we deliver infrastructure, from education and university work and research to product manufacturing to procurement to government policies. You have to have a foundation upon which you can build all of these systems that go into play. And as we all know in this room, infrastructure is incredibly complex. The delivery is incredibly challenging. Again, it will require a systemic change of our look and of our goals. So I'll give a brief introduction for any of you who may not be familiar with Envision and what it is. It is really a blueprint for better infrastructure. And as I mentioned, it is the measuring of sustainability within infrastructure. There's a famous management consultant, Peter Drucker, who has a quote, "You can't manage what you can't measure." So Envision provides the ability for us to measure sustainability. And it also drives better project management. I am a firm believer that in addition to the many altruistic points that I mentioned about the future of our planet, sustainable infrastructure is just better infrastructure. When you really look at it, when it looks at the economic impacts, the environmental impacts, the social impacts, it's just higher quality, better infrastructure for everyone, more cost efficient, better outcomes. And so when we pursue sustainable infrastructure, we are really just pursuing better project management and better project delivery. A unique aspect of Envision is that it applies to all different types of infrastructure. Again, there may be sector-specific systems, but if we are going to solve these challenges as a whole, we need a global universal set of principles that's going to guide action across all of these different sectors. And Envision does that. It's more than just a guidance manual. It is an entire, again, system of education, training, and resources. So you have the guidance manual. You also have a checklist, an early planning assessment tool to establish those goals. You have a professional training and credentialing program, and I've already met several of the Envision sustainability professionals that are in the room today. We also have a third-party project verification and award system. This is important because while we don't necessarily advocate that every project that uses Envision needs to go through a third-party verification, in certain cases it is very important, especially, as I mentioned, for the accountability of government spending or the accountability of the outcomes that infrastructure owners are delivering to communities. The system itself covers the triple bottom line of sustainability in terms of the environmental, social, and economic impacts, but we divide those further into quality of life, which is the community impacts, leadership, which looks at, again, the collaboration, planning, and economic impacts of the project, resource allocation, which is our traditional use of efficiency in materials, energy, and water, natural world, which looks at our environmental and biodiversity impacts, and climate and resilience, which is both the mitigation of climate change and our adaptation and preparedness for climate change. So you can see it as a very comprehensive system. I don't expect you to read this slide, but this is just to show you how it unfolds into the different 64 sustainability indicators. So you can imagine, again, on a typical project, when you have to deal with budget, cost, design standards, numerous different companies, numerous different regulators, and then layer on top of that 64 different sustainability indicators. You need a framework like this. It's not enough to just say, yeah, we're thinking about sustainability, we have a few sustainability goals. If you are not consistently looking at all of these factors, you're missing opportunities. And that's, again, the value of Envision. It provides that systemic way of evaluating this. And we see, again, as projects develop, we know that infrastructure projects can take many years, involve many different people and organizations. If we establish those sustainability goals at the beginning, tools like Envision help those goals carry through every step of the project, from planning, design, construction, even operations. You need this kind of accountability and consistency in order to realize those outcomes. And this is down once we get to the level of the credit itself. So here you can see, again, we don't just draw a line and say you're sustainable or not sustainable. We're always trying to be more sustainable, to improve, and Envision provides many different opportunities for us to advance. So as you go from left to right, you're adding additional criteria that you're looking at in the project. You're elevating those criteria. You're seeking higher performance. And just to give two examples, on the two right columns, you'll see conserving. Conserving is where we are targeting a net zero or a no impact. That's very challenging for a lot of infrastructure projects, but we also have to recognize that we're not going to achieve the goals that we want simply by not doing bad. Sometimes we keep thinking of, let's just reduce the negative impacts. But beyond that, in Envision, we have the restorative level. And this is important because when you really think of why are we developing this infrastructure, it's often to have a positive impact on our communities, on the environment, on the economy. So we should be aiming for that. We should be aspiring to restorative infrastructure to take us to a better place, and Envision recognizes that and sets that as a goal in many cases. Of course, I have to talk about cost, because that is the number one question I always receive, the perception that sustainability costs more. I would really challenge that. I think when you look at the principles of sustainability in terms of efficient use of resources, delivery of better outcomes, protection of our communities and environment, it doesn't cost more. Often it's just where we draw the line of that cost and who's paying the cost. But I also challenge the idea that sustainability needs to cost more even at the project level. Because often what we see, and this is a common project delivery diagram, right? As the project develops, our ability to make changes decreases while the cost to make those changes increases. What we see today is still a reticence to adopt sustainability. And so what we see is that we are still designing, in many cases, conventional projects, and sustainability is considered an add-on. It's extra features that we will wait and see, and if there's time or if there's budget, we'll add them in at the end. That, of course, will add cost to the project. But if we start at the beginning and rethink the concept of the project, and how do we incorporate sustainability from the beginning, and how do we think of the outcomes that we want and redesign the project then, sustainability does not need to cost more. And I'll give many examples of where, in fact, sustainability was the best economic choice for the community. So I really challenge this idea that sustainability costs more or that there is a premium on sustainability. I think it's a mental shift that we need to make and a commitment to sustainability that we need to make earlier in the project. So shifting a little bit to the adoption of Envision within the United States and Canada, as you can see, it's fairly widespread across the country. It's not regional. Of course, I'm very proud of the projects here in Italy as well, and a couple projects, pilot projects in the Middle East. But 125 verified projects, over $130 billion US, that have completed verification, and over 6,000 active credentialed professionals. So make no mistake, this is still a very small portion of the overall infrastructure industry, but it is by far a significant enough sample to prove that this is an effective tool, that it has legs, as we say, within the industry. It has a foundation, and so we think there is a great opportunity to scale this drastically over the next few years as we need to, as we see this massive investment in infrastructure. So again, the value of Envision, I will talk about it most often as this common language that is absolutely necessary. As I mentioned at the start, the ability to share information. Envision has already been the conduit from which we have learned about the projects here in Italy. Likewise, we have shared the work that we are doing. It gives that impetus to communicate, to talk, to share ideas. It's incredibly valuable. I'll also just briefly talk about the feedback that we receive from projects, is that it is a good project management tool, as I mentioned. So again, when you think about how do we develop sustainably, it requires better communication early in the project, communication of all the stakeholders and participants, a better understanding of the community needs. Even if we were to set aside the value of sustainability, those are just good project management and good project delivery concepts. So in many ways, the adoption of Envision can lead to better project management, even for those who might be skeptical, again, of the beneficial outcomes. So now I'll walk through a variety of ways that we're seeing Envision applied within the United States. And this speaks to the point I made earlier about the need for systemic change. So again, while Envision is a project tool, we see it causing changes all around, which is the goal that we want to see. So I kind of start at the top and I work my way down. But looking at federal regulations, in Canada, there's the Infrastructure Canada, which is the Ministry of Infrastructure for the country. They have a climate lens, which requires that all federally funded infrastructure do a climate change mitigation assessment. And Envision is one of the accepted methodologies for conducting that. This is important because government should be in the position of providing these regulations, but they are not always in the position of defining how an industry should meet those regulations or the methodology that they should use. And at the same time, it's more appropriate that the industry, with our experience and knowledge, develop those methodologies. So Envision can be, again, a platform, a foundation upon which government can build laws and regulations while relying on industry-developed methodologies, which is incredibly important. We also see it at the state level within the United States. So last year, the California state legislature passed a bill streamlining the judicial review process for environmental transit projects. And again, Envision is one of the ways in which projects demonstrate their commitment to environmental outcomes. This is important because I assume it's the same in every country. Infrastructure permitting and processes and environmental reviews can take a significant amount of time. And that is good in some sense because we need strong regulations to protect our environment and our communities. At the same time, it can often delay projects to the point where they're no longer responding to the needs of the community at that time. And we also know from the massive investments that we are seeing that there is a need to develop large amounts of infrastructure very quickly. So how are we going to do that with a protracted permitting process? So here the bill allows for a bifurcating of the process so that those projects that we know have positive outcomes through their assessment with Envision can go through a faster permitting process, and we retain the strong regulations and permitting process for those projects that may have negative impacts. So I think it's a win-win that allows for a protection of our communities, but also for faster development of needed infrastructure. We see it at the city and county level as well, so at the local government. Here, again, it's city councils, mayors, boards of supervisors, similar to the federal level where they play an important role in establishing the goals of the community, but they're not engineers. They don't know infrastructure delivery. Their purpose is to set an ambition. And this gives then, underneath them, the Bureau of Engineering, the Department of Public Works, or the infrastructure owners, the permission to use tools like Envision to explore sustainability. So we work in a very risk-averse industry for many good reasons. There is safety, there is protection of health. So when we say we want to develop more sustainably, that means we want to do something different. And that is not always easy to do. So we need to provide those engineers who are working on projects the permission from the authorities that they can do something more, that they can explore, that they can use taxpayer funds to improve the sustainability of the project. And these city-county resolutions are incredibly important. And again, Envision provides the framework around which that can happen. It's not enough for a mayor to say, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. How? How? The engineers need something that says, okay, this is how I'm going to do my work differently today on my project that I'm working on. This is how I am going to help achieve that goal. And Envision provides that connection between our higher level political goals and the actual project implementation. I'm sure it's the same here, where we often see a disconnect between the goal and the actual work that's being done. And of course, funding as well. So this is the California Department of Water Resources Division of Flood Management. I know I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here, but here we often have government bodies that are legally responsible for regulating very specific things, and they have a narrow window of their legal obligations. But sustainability is about layering benefits. It's about improving things for the entire community. And so sometimes these regulatory bodies force us into siloed approaches with one problem, one solution, and that's not very sustainable. So here they found a solution, which is that the Division of Flood Management, which obviously works on flood management projects, recognizes that there's a value to the state when these flood management projects take on social impacts. They look at the environment, the communities, the economic impacts, and they provide additional funding through their use of Envision for those efforts. So they can stay within their regulatory purview, but have an incentive for projects that add benefits beyond just delivering flood management. We also see it then in requests for proposals. So this would be the tender or the procurement process. We see it at different levels. So sometimes the infrastructure owner will ask that an Envision sustainability professional be involved in the project, just a trained person in sustainability. Sometimes they'll require that consultant be trained and conduct a self-assessment, and then the owner retains the option of either pursuing a third-party verification or not. And sometimes if the owner is very familiar with Envision, they'll actually put in the contract that the consultant will complete the documentation and go through the third-party verification process themselves. So there's a wide range of flexibility in how we see owners requiring Envision in projects. It's also valuable for the owner in terms of a portfolio assessment. So this is the New York City Department of Design and Construction. They oversee all of the infrastructure construction in New York City. They have a long-standing commitment to sustainability. They have many sustainability policies, but they used Envision to assess their performance against a more national and international standard. So here they took a typology of one of their common projects. They mapped their existing policy and design guidelines and saw where they could be doing better. So in the white, you see their baseline. This is what they're already doing. In the left, you'll see the 5 Envision categories. And then in green, yellow, red, they identified the gap analysis of where are the opportunities for improvement. So here, the great outcome is that they can identify that they're already doing very well in terms of the social commitments, but really they have a long way to go in terms of climate change and adaptation. And so if they are going to make targeted investments or improvements, that is the best place for them to invest in the future. So it can be valuable on a higher level as well. And then finally, looking in at design guidelines, I'll just briefly mention the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which really is the epitome of why the Institute, why we feel like we exist. So the Port Authority had a pre-existing sustainable infrastructure guideline document. It was older than Envision, but over the years it got out of date. They needed to renew it. And so they had to make the decision of whether they would invest in updating their guidelines, and ultimately they decided to throw them out and to adopt Envision. One, because it was free, it didn't cost them anything. They could adopt Envision. But also when I asked them, they said, well, for us, we would spend all of this time and money, and all we would have is a manual that we would hand out to our staff, and they would have to apply. But with Envision, we get the manual, we get a credential and training program, we get additional educational resources, we become part of a network. They can talk to other ports that are using Envision, learn from what they're doing. And as I mentioned, that's really why ISI and Envision exists, recognizing this value in a shared framework that saves time, that saves money, that allows us to learn from one another and grow because we're all working from the same foundation. So that was the story. And then just briefly, I'll talk about a few projects. This is the historic Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta, Georgia. On the left, obviously, the before photo. On the right, after. It was a illegal dumping ground. It would occasionally catch fire. It would flood, which was good for putting out the fires, but not good for the neighborhood. Really the kind of worst possible site that you can imagine. And this is what they transformed it into. But the interesting part is this was primarily a flood management issue. And so we could have seen just a retention basin, ugly retention basin with a fence that says, stay out, this is dangerous. And instead they decided to develop a community amenity. This is a beautiful park. You wouldn't even know that this was providing stormwater and flood management services. And I think this is the value that we see with infrastructure and with sustainability, is it's a layering of the benefits, multi-benefit projects, as we say, and looking at how we can bring infrastructure back into our communities and add value so that it's not only providing the basic services, but providing needs that our community wants. And that really will help with NIMBYism, right? The not in my backyard concept. There is a perception that infrastructure is dirty, that it is noisy, that it is unwanted. Nobody wants it near them. But through this, we can make it NIMBYism, I guess, in my backyard. Who wouldn't want this in your backyard? And you can look at the value to the community, the city itself. So a major source of revenue for the city is property tax values. Look at the picture on the left and tell me what you think the property values are for those sites surrounding this as opposed to the right. This is a revenue generator for the city. It's an investment in the city. And so there is economic gain to come from this as well. So this is just one example, but it's an important theme that I see coming up again and again. For many years, we told engineers that we don't want to see infrastructure, we want it buried, we want it away, we want it outside. And now we're seeing a transition where it's how do we bring infrastructure back into our communities, make it relevant to people, make it valued by people. And in addition to the amenities that it provides, it also makes infrastructure more conscious in people's awareness. So one of the challenges with funding infrastructure is, again, people don't see where the energy comes from. They don't see where the water comes from. They don't appreciate what's being done. They don't understand how complex it is. We can change that by bringing infrastructure back into our communities in a way that they value and that they see the benefits. This one is more economic. This is the Kansas City Streetcar. Here they just did an economic evaluation of how the public transportation would benefit businesses, would benefit the city. It really transformed a neighborhood that was slightly dangerous, that was unused, again with low property values, and the addition of the public transportation system created several $1 billion of increased property value across the city. So this was a major investment, but at the same time, a major revenue generator. Also, the LaGuardia Airport. This one was just a massive multi-billion-dollar project, and we often see it's with the larger infrastructure projects where they see the value in pursuing that third-party verification through Envision. As you can imagine, a project of this size would be disruptive to communities, and Envision was a great way for the airport authority to demonstrate that they were pursuing goals, that they were meeting the community needs, and that they were doing it in a way that was sensitive to the impacts that they were having. And finally, the California high-speed rail. I'm very jealous of you here in Italy that you have beautiful rail systems. If you ever have to ride a rail in the US, I'm sorry, it's bad. This is the first true high-speed rail in the entire United States that's being developed. It's also the largest infrastructure project at $80 billion US, linking San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so we're very excited about it. You have lots of them. I understand it's probably not too exciting for you. But this was a massive project that, as you can imagine, over hundreds of miles is impacting environments, is impacting communities. Again, $80 billion. And they took a very advanced and optimistic approach to sustainability at every level of procurement. And they've used, again, this massive investment of infrastructure to change the industry. think of all the concrete that they're producing, and they're demanding that the concrete producers make limited carbon concrete, right? Lower carbon concrete. They're, hiring thousands and thousands of workers, and they're looking at the ESG impacts of those companies. And so this is the value that infrastructure projects can have. When you think about, my background is in architecture. I keep that quiet around the engineers, but and we have sustainable buildings. They've been around for 20 or 30 years, but when you look at the comparison of the impact that infrastructure has and the investment that we make in our infrastructure, especially now, there is so much more that we could be doing. There's so much more value that we could be layering into those infrastructure projects. And tools like Envision are a way for us to think about those opportunities, to challenge our preconceptions, to change the way we work, and to ultimately deliver outcomes that are better for our communities and better for our future. So I really appreciate the opportunity to address you today. As I mentioned, it's wonderful to be back here in Italy, and thank you to ICMQ. Thank you.